3-star athletes thought they could humiliate the elderly substitute teacher by mocking her age and making her first day a living nightmare. What they didn't know was that Margaret "Maggie" Patterson had knockout power in both fists and had trained champions in some of the toughest gyms in Chicago before retiring to peaceful suburban teaching. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty at Riverside Valley High School revealed a secret that would change everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Patterson adjusted her reading glasses as she stood before the imposing brick facade of Riverside Valley High School, her weathered leather briefcase clutched firmly in her right hand. At 62 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a simple navy cardigan over sensible slacks, she looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a grandmother substitute teacher. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as students streamed toward the building, their voices creating the familiar symphony of teenage energy that Maggie had grown to appreciate during her 3 months of substitute teaching. In the district, the assignment had come through the usual channels the night before. Mrs. Henderson, the regular English teacher for advanced placement literature, had called in sick with what sounded like a particularly nasty case of the flu. Maggie would be covering 3 sections of senior-level English, complete with discussions of Shakespeare, college prep essays, and the kind of literary analysis that challenged even the brightest students. It was exactly the type of intellectual engagement that had drawn her to substitute teaching after her retirement from her previous career. Maggie's transition to education had been surprisingly smooth, though she sometimes caught herself using terminology and organizational methods that seemed unusual to her civilian colleagues. Her lesson plans were structured with military precision, her classroom management techniques were remarkably effective, and her ability to command respect from even the most challenging students had earned her a reputation as the substitute teacher that principals actually hoped to see walk through their doors. The main hallway of Riverside Valley buzzed with the controlled chaos that characterized the 15 minutes before the first period. Students clustered around lockers, catching up on weekend adventures and cramming for tests they'd forgotten about until this moment. Maggie navigated through the crowds with the kind of situational awareness that had become second nature over the decades, noting the social dynamics and potential trouble spots that every experienced educator learned to identify. Her destination was room 247, a corner classroom on the 2nd floor that Mrs. Henderson had described as having excellent natural light and a view of the football field that could be either inspiring or distracting, depending on the season. Maggie climbed the stairs with steady steps, her practical shoes making soft sounds on the polished linoleum that reminded her of the countless training facilities she'd walked through over the years. The classroom was everything Mrs. Henderson had promised, with tall windows that flooded the space with morning sunlight and walls lined with literary quotes that spoke to the importance of words and ideas. Maggie set her briefcase on the teacher's desk and began her routine inspection of the room, checking the arrangement of desks, the condition of the whiteboard, and the location of emergency exits and communication equipment. Old habits die hard, and thoroughness has always been the foundation of her professional success. Mrs. Henderson had left detailed lesson plans and seating charts, along with notes about individual students who might require special attention or accommodation. Maggie studied these materials with the same careful analysis she had once applied to scouting reports, learning names and faces and potential challenges before her first students arrived. The warning bell rang at 7:55, sending a ripple of increased urgency through the hallways as students made their final dash to first period classrooms. Maggie positioned herself near the door, ready to greet her students with the kind of professional warmth that established positive expectations while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Her first period, advanced placement literature class, consisted Of 24 seniors, most of whom entered the classroom with the kind of confident energy that came from being academic high achievers preparing for college. They settled into their assigned seats with minimal fuss, pulling out notebooks and laptops while casting curious glances at the substitute teacher, who would be guiding their discussion of Hamlet's soliloquies. "Good morning, class," Maggie said, her voice carrying clearly across the room with the kind of natural authority that commanded attention without shouting. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, and I'll be your substitute teacher today while Mrs. Henderson recovers from her illness." The students responded with the polite murmur of acknowledgement that characterized well-trained advanced placement classes. These were the kind of teenagers who understood that substitute teacher days could either be productive learning experiences or chaotic free periods, depending largely on how they chose to behave. Maggie launched into Mrs. Henderson's planned lesson on the psychological complexity of Hamlet's character development, facilitating a discussion that quickly revealed the intellectual capabilities of her students. Sarah Chun offered insightful analysis of the prince's relationship with his mother, while David Kim drew connections between Hamlet's indecision and contemporary leadership challenges. Michael Torres contributed thoughtful observations about the play's exploration of duty and revenge that demonstrated genuine engagement with the material. The period proceeded smoothly, with Maggie guiding the discussion using the kind of structured questioning techniques that encourage critical thinking, while keeping the conversation focused on literary analysis. She found herself genuinely enjoying the intellectual energy of the advanced students and their willingness to wrestle with complex themes and character motivations. As the first period ended and students gathered their materials, several approached Maggie's desk to clarify assignment details or ask questions about upcoming tests. Their respectful curiosity and academic focus reminded her why she had chosen to spend her retirement years in educational settings rather than pursuing the leisure activities that many of her contemporaries favored. Second period brought a different energy entirely. The regular English 11 class that filed into room 247 carried themselves with less academic confidence, but more social awareness of their place in the high school hierarchy. These were students who were more concerned with social dynamics than literary analysis, more focused on their relationships and reputations than their grade point averages. Among this group, 3 students immediately caught Maggie's attention through their body language and positioning within the classroom's social ecosystem. They claimed seats in the back corner, not because they were shy or disengaged, but because they wanted to establish their territory and maintain visual control over the rest of the class. Brandon Mitchell carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. At 17, he possessed the kind of natural athleticism that had made him the starting running back on Riverside Valley's football team and the center of attention at weekend parties. His sandy brown hair was styled with expensive products, and his clothes bore the subtle logos that identified them as significantly more costly than typical teenage fashion. Brandon's family owned the largest auto dealership in the county, giving him access to the kind of resources and connections that provided insulation from the normal consequences of teenage misbehavior. His father had been a local football star in his own generation, and the family's financial contributions to the athletic program ensured that Brandon's behavior was often overlooked in favor of his contribution to the team's success. Jessica Ward positioned herself beside Brandon with the practiced ease of someone who had claimed her place in the social hierarchy through a combination of natural beauty and calculated aggression. Her long blonde hair caught the classroom's fluorescent lighting perfectly, and her makeup had been applied with the skill of someone who understood the visual impact of every detail. Jessica's family had moved to Riverside Valley when her father took a position as the head of surgery at the regional medical center, bringing with them the kind of professional prestige that translated into social influence. Jessica's approach to high school social dynamics was strategic and ruthless, identifying potential threats to her position and neutralizing them through carefully orchestrated campaigns of exclusion and humiliation. She had learned that appearing supportive while systematically undermining her targets was more effective than direct confrontation, and her techniques had proven devastatingly effective against other students who had challenged her authority. Marcus Thompson completed the triumvirate, though his role was more complex than his association with Brandon and Jessica initially suggested. At 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a basketball player, Marcus had the physical presence to intimidate when necessary, but his primary value to the group lay in his technical skills and family connections. His mother worked in the school district's administrative offices, giving him access to information about policies, procedures, and personnel changes that proved useful for avoiding consequences. Marcus carried the latest smartphone and tablet technology, equipment that he used to document social interactions and gather intelligence about potential targets. His technical abilities had made him invaluable to Brandon and Jessica's campaigns, providing digital evidence and social media amplification for their various schemes. The three had developed their partnership over 2 years of shared classes and social activities, learning to coordinate their individual strengths into an effective system for maintaining their dominance over Riverside Valley's social landscape. Brandon provided the charisma and athletic credibility. Jessica contributed strategic thinking and social manipulation skills, and Marcus offered technical support and administrative intelligence. Maggie observed their positioning and interactions with the kind of analytical attention that had once been essential for identifying potential threats in more dangerous environments. Their body language indicated confidence bordering on arrogance. Their whispered conversations suggested they were planning something more interesting than English literature discussion, and their occasional glances in her direction carried a calculating quality that set off internal warning systems she had developed over decades of professional experience. The lesson plan for the second period focused on creative writing techniques, specifically the development of character voice and dialogue that revealed personality and motivation. Maggie introduced the assignment with the same professional competence she had demonstrated with her advanced placement students, explaining the requirements and expectations while scanning the room for signs of engagement or resistance. Of the students responded positively to the creative assignment, pulling out notebooks and beginning to brainstorm character ideas with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested they found creative expression more engaging than literary analysis. The classroom filled with the productive energy of students working on individual projects, punctuated by quiet conversations about character development and plot possibilities. Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus, however, seemed more interested in conducting their own private conference than participating in the assigned activity. Their whispered conversations became more animated as the period progressed, and Maggie noticed that their attention was increasingly focused on her rather than their writing assignments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 20 minutes into the period, Brandon raised his hand with exaggerated politeness that immediately identified his question as something other than genuine academic inquiry. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the classroom with theatrical concern, "I was wondering if you needed help reaching anything on the high shelves. I know it can be challenging for people your age to manage some of the classroom equipment." The question was delivered with perfect deniability, phrased as helpful concern while actually drawing attention to Maggie's age in a way that established her as different from and potentially less capable than the younger teachers the students were accustomed to. Jessica smirked appreciatively at Brandon's technique, while Marcus held his phone in a position that suggested he was recording the interaction for later analysis or distribution. Maggie's response was calm and professional, acknowledging Brandon's offer while declining the assistance. "Thank you for your concern, Brandon, but I'm managing quite well. Please focus on developing your character dialogue for the assignment. The deflection was smooth and appropriate, but Maggie recognized it as only the opening move in whatever psychological operation Brandon's group was planning. Their body language indicated they had interpreted her polite response as a sign of weakness rather than professional courtesy, and she could see them exchanging glances that suggested their strategy was proceeding according to plan. 15 minutes later, Jessica contributed her own seemingly innocent comment that was designed to further establish Maggie as an outsider who didn't understand the social dynamics of contemporary education. "Mrs. Patterson," Jessica said with false sweetness, "do you think your teaching methods might be a little old-fashioned for today's students? We're used to more interactive technology and collaborative learning approaches." The criticism was wrapped in educational terminology that gave it academic legitimacy while actually questioning Maggie's competence and relevance. Jessica's delivery was perfect, suggesting helpful feedback while actually undermining Maggie's authority in front of the entire class. Several other students looked up from their writing assignments, sensing that something more interesting than character development was happening at the front of the classroom. The social dynamics were shifting as Brandon and Jessica tested Maggie's responses and established themselves as willing to challenge adult authority in ways that other students might find entertaining or inspiring. Maggie maintained her professional composure while internally noting the sophisticated nature of their psychological tactics. These weren't random acts of teenage rebellion, but coordinated attempts to establish dominance through carefully calculated challenges to her authority and credibility. "I appreciate your feedback, Jessica," Maggie said evenly. Different teaching approaches work well for different learning objectives. Today's assignment is designed to help you develop individual creative voices, which requires focused personal reflection rather than collaborative discussion. The response was educationally sound and professionally delivered, but Maggie could see that Jessica interpreted it as defensive rather than confident. The slight smile that crossed Jessica's features indicated that she believed her psychological pressure was having the desired effect. As second period drew to a close, Marcus made his contribution to their campaign with a comment that was designed to be overheard by nearby students while appearing to be a private observation to his friends. "I don't think Mrs. Patterson realizes how things work around here," he said in a stage whisper that carried to several surrounding desks. "Maybe someone should explain the social dynamics to Grandma before she gets in over her head." The use of Grandma was deliberate and calculated, reducing Maggie from a professional educator to a stereotypical elderly relative who was out of touch with contemporary reality. The term was designed to be spread throughout the school's social networks, creating a label that would undermine her authority with other students and classes. Maggie heard the comment clearly, but chose not to respond directly, recognizing that any reaction would only encourage further escalation and provide Marcus with the social media content he was obviously hoping to capture. Instead, she continued circulating through the classroom, offering individual feedback on creative writing assignments, while mentally cataloging the group's tactics and preparing for whatever escalation they were planning. When the bell rang, ending second period, Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus gathered their materials with the satisfied air of students who believed their campaign was proceeding successfully. They had tested Maggie's responses to age-related challenges, questioned her teaching competence, and introduced a derogatory nickname that could be used to undermine her authority throughout the school. As they filed out of the classroom, Maggie heard Jessica telling another student that the new substitute was totally out of touch, and that someone should help her understand how things really work at Riverside Valley. The comment was designed to spread their narrative beyond their immediate circle, establishing Maggie as a target for broader social pressure. Third period brought another regular English class, and Maggie noticed that word of the grandma substitute had already begun to spread through the school's social networks. Students entered the classroom with the kind of anticipatory energy That suggested they had heard about the morning's interactions and were curious to see how the elderly substitute would handle their particular group dynamics. The lesson proceeded normally for the first half of the period, with most students engaging appropriately with the assigned reading comprehension activities. However, Maggie was aware of increased whispered conversations and occasional glances that suggested some students were waiting for something more entertaining than educational content. The disruption, when it came, was more direct than the subtle psychological pressure that had characterized the second period. A student near the middle of the room raised his hand and asked, with barely concealed amusement, whether Grandma Patterson needed help operating the computer projection system, since older teachers sometimes struggle with modern technology. The question represented a significant escalation, using the derogatory nickname publicly and explicitly questioning Maggie's technological competence in front of a different group of students. The student's timing and phrasing suggested that the inquiry had been coordinated with Brandon's group, possibly through text messages or social media communications during the passing period. Maggie's response maintained her professional demeanor, while clearly establishing boundaries about appropriate classroom behavior. "My name is Mrs. Patterson," she said firmly but without anger, "and I'm quite comfortable with all the classroom technology. Please use respectful forms of address when speaking to teachers and substitute teachers." The correction was appropriate and necessary, but Maggie could see that some students interpreted her need to address the disrespect as evidence that their psychological pressure was succeeding. The social dynamics were shifting as word spread that the substitute teacher could be challenged without serious consequences. By the end of third period, Maggie understood that she was facing a coordinated campaign designed to undermine her authority and establish her as an ineffective substitute who could be safely ignored or openly disrespected. The tactics were sophisticated for teenage social warfare, suggesting that Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus had experience in conducting similar operations against other targets. The lunch period provided Maggie with time to process the morning's events and consider her options for dealing with the escalating situation. She could report the disrespectful behavior to the administration, request a different assignment, or attempt to address the problem through direct conversation with the students involved. However, Maggie's professional experience had taught her that some situations required a different approach than traditional administrative channels. Sometimes the most effective response to psychological warfare was demonstrating capabilities that the attackers hadn't anticipated. And sometimes the best way to earn respect was showing strength rather than appealing to authority. As she prepared for her afternoon classes, Maggie found herself thinking about the boxing gloves that remained packed away in her apartment closet. Relics from a career that her current students couldn't imagine, and a reminder of skills that retirement hadn't erased. The afternoon would bring new challenges, and Maggie Patterson was beginning to realize that her peaceful transition to education might require drawing on resources from her previous professional life that she had hoped to leave undisturbed. The cafeteria at Riverside Valley High School buzzed with the controlled chaos of 800 teenagers navigating lunch period social dynamics. Maggie Patterson sat alone at a small table near the faculty section, methodically eating her sandwich while observing the complex ecosystem of adolescent relationships that played out around her. Her morning experiences had given her valuable intelligence about the social structures she was dealing with, and the lunch period provided an opportunity to analyze the broader patterns that govern student behavior. From her vantage point, Maggie could see Brandon Mitchell holding court at a large round table in the center of the cafeteria, surrounded by football players and their admirers. His animated storytelling was drawing laughs and attention from his audience, and Maggie noticed that his gestures occasionally pointed in her direction, suggesting that her morning interactions had become part of his social media content. Jessica Ward occupied a strategically positioned table near the windows, where natural lighting provided optimal conditions for the constant photography that seemed to characterize her daily routine. Her followers clustered around her with the kind of devoted attention usually reserved for celebrities, hanging on her every word while competing for inclusion in her carefully curated social media presence. Marcus Thompson moved between tables with the kind of purposeful networking that suggested he was gathering information and coordinating activities rather than simply socializing. His expensive technology remained constantly active, documenting interactions and maintaining the keys in the digital communications that connected various social groups throughout the school. 20 minutes into the lunch period, Maggie noticed a shift in the energy around Brandon's table as Jessica approached with her entourage in tow. The convergence of the two social leaders created a focal point that drew attention from surrounding tables, with students positioning themselves to observe whatever coordination was taking place between the school's most influential personalities. The conversation at Brandon's table became more animated after Jessica's arrival, with frequent glances toward Maggie's position and obvious excitement about whatever plan they were developing. Marcus joined the group within minutes, his technical equipment already active and positioned to document whatever operation they were planning for the afternoon. Maggie finished her lunch with deliberate calm while tracking the movement and behavior patterns of students throughout the cafeteria. Her situational awareness identified several other potential allies and threats, noting which faculty members were present and alert, which students seemed to be operating independently of the major social groups, and which areas of the cafeteria provided the best sightlines and communication opportunities. The warning bell for fifth period sent students streaming toward their afternoon classes, and Maggie gathered her materials while mentally preparing for whatever escalation Brandon's group had planned during their lunch period coordination session. Her experience had taught her that psychological operations often intensified after the initial probing phase, as attackers gained confidence and refined their tactics based on their target's responses. Fifth period brought Maggie's most challenging class of the day, sophomore English, with 32 students crammed into a classroom designed for 25. The overcrowded conditions created natural stress and tension that could be exploited by anyone looking to create disruption, and the younger students were generally more susceptible to peer pressure and social influence than the seniors she had worked with earlier in the day. Brandon Mitchell was not enrolled in this class, but his influence had clearly preceded Maggie's arrival. Students entered the classroom with the kind of anticipatory energy that suggested they had received instructions or encouragement to test the substitute teacher's authority and patience. Several students were openly recording with their phones, positioned to capture whatever entertainment they expected to unfold. The lesson plan called for group work on persuasive writing techniques, requiring students to collaborate on developing arguments and supporting evidence for controversial topics. Maggie recognized the inherent chaos potential in the assignment, but also understood that modifying the regular teacher's plans would be interpreted as weakness or incompetence by students who were looking for reasons to challenge her authority. She divided the class into groups of 4 and assigned topics ranging from school dress codes to social media privacy policies, subjects that were designed to engage teenage interest while teaching important analytical and communication skills. Most groups began working productively, but Maggie immediately identified 2 clusters of students who seemed more interested in testing her management abilities than completing their assignments. The first disruption came 15 minutes into the period, when a sophomore girl named Amanda raised her hand and asked, with exaggerated concern, whether Mrs. Patterson needed help understanding how modern students approached research and information gathering. "We mostly use digital sources now," Amanda explained with false helpfulness, "and I know older generations sometimes struggle with evaluating online credibility." The comment was clearly inspired by Brandon's morning tactics, using ageist assumptions to question Maggie's competence while appearing to offer assistance. Amanda's delivery was less sophisticated than Jessica's psychological techniques, but the underlying strategy was identical. establish the substitute as outdated and ineffective while positioning themselves as more knowledgeable. About contemporary education, Maggie's response maintained her professional standards while clearly establishing expectations for respectful communication. Thank you for your concern, Amanda. I'm quite familiar with digital research methods and source evaluation. Please focus on developing your group's argument rather than worrying about my technical abilities. The correction was appropriate and necessary, but Maggie could see that several students interpreted her need to address the disrespect as confirmation that their psychological pressure was having the desired effect. Phone cameras captured her response, undoubtedly for later analysis and potential social media distribution. 10 minutes later, a sophomore boy named Tyler attempted a more direct challenge to Maggie's authority by loudly announcing that his group couldn't complete their assignment because Grandma Patterson's instructions were too confusing for modern students to understand. The use of the derogatory nickname in front of a different class confirmed that Brandon's group had successfully spread their campaign beyond their immediate circle. Tyler's comment was designed to create a public confrontation that would either force Maggie to appear weak by ignoring the disrespect or provide social media content by responding with visible frustration or anger. The strategy was crude compared to the sophisticated psychological tactics employed by Brandon's group, but it represented a significant escalation in the campaign against her authority. Maggie approached Tyler's group with calm professionalism, addressing the assignment confusion while deliberately avoiding any reaction to the disrespectful nickname. Let me clarify the requirements for your group. Tyler, you're developing an argument about social media privacy policies, which means you need to identify your position, gather supporting evidence, and anticipate counterarguments. Her response focused on educational content rather than disciplinary action, demonstrating that she would not be distracted from teaching by psychological pressure tactics. However, Maggie was acutely aware that Tyler's public challenge had been observed and recorded by multiple students, creating content that would inevitably reach Brandon's group and inform their strategy for future escalations. The remainder of fifth period proceeded with increasing tension as word spread about the grandma substitute who was being successfully challenged by multiple students across different classes. Phone recordings captured several interactions, and Maggie could hear whispered conversations that suggested students were coordinating their approaches based on real-time communication with Brandon's social network. By the end of fifth period, Maggie understood that she was facing a coordinated campaign that extended far beyond the original trio of instigators. Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus had successfully weaponized the school's social media networks to spread their narrative and encourage broader participation in undermining her authority. Sixth period brought another group of sophomores, and the pattern of disrespectful challenges continued with increasing boldness. Students entered the classroom already familiar with the Grandma Patterson narrative, and several made pointed comments about hoping they wouldn't have to deal with outdated teaching methods or technology problems during their class period. The lesson focused on literary analysis of short stories, requiring students to identify themes, character development, and symbolic elements in contemporary fiction. Maggie selected pieces that she hoped would engage teenage interest while providing opportunities for meaningful discussion about universal human experiences and moral complexity. However, the academic content was consistently undermined by a series of challenges that had clearly been coordinated through social media communications during the previous class period. Students questioned whether Maggie's interpretations of contemporary literature were relevant to modern perspectives, suggested that her discussion questions were too old-fashioned for current students, and repeatedly used the grandma nickname, while pretending it was affectionate rather than disrespectful. The most significant escalation came when a sophomore girl named Brittany stood up in the middle of class discussion and announced that she needed to call her parents because she was concerned that the substitute teacher's outdated methods were preventing her from receiving the quality education she deserved. Brittany's dramatic performance was clearly designed for the phone cameras that immediately focused on her, capturing her theatrical concern for later social media distribution. Maggie's response was swift and professional, directing Brittany to sit down and participate appropriately in class discussion or report to the office for administrative intervention. The boundary setting was necessary and appropriate, but Maggie could see that several students interpreted her need to enforce classroom rules as evidence that their psychological pressure was succeeding. "I think Grandma Patterson is getting upset," one student whispered loudly enough to be overheard, while another added, "Maybe she should retire before she gets in over her head." The comments were designed to provoke a visible reaction that could be captured and weaponized for further social media campaigns. Maggie maintained her composure, while internally noting the sophisticated coordination that was driving the escalating challenges to her authority. These weren't random acts of teenage rebellion, but carefully orchestrated psychological operations designed to create viral content, while systematically undermining her credibility and effectiveness. As sixth period ended, Maggie realized that the campaign against her had achieved significant momentum throughout the school's social networks. Students were entering her classroom with predetermined expectations about challenging her authority, and the grandma narrative had become a self-reinforcing cycle that encouraged increasingly bold disrespect. Her final class of the day was senior-level creative writing, a smaller group of students who were generally more focused on academic achievement than social media drama. Maggie hoped that the older students would be less susceptible to the peer pressure and coordination tactics that had characterized her afternoon classes. However, Brandon Mitchell was enrolled in seventh period creative writing, and his presence immediately shifted the classroom dynamics from academic focus to social theater. He entered with his usual swagger, now enhanced by the confidence of someone whose campaign was achieving measurable success throughout the school community. Jessica Ward was also enrolled in the class, completing the original instigator duo while providing the strategic thinking and social manipulation skills that had made their morning operations so effective. Marcus Thompson's absence meant that technical documentation would be handled by other students' phones, but the core leadership team was present and prepared for whatever escalation they had planned. The creative writing assignment focused on character development and dialogue, requiring students to create fictional personalities with authentic voices and realistic motivations. Maggie introduced the lesson with the same professional competence she had demonstrated throughout the day, but she was acutely aware that Brandon and Jessica were conducting their own private conference while pretending to listen to her instructions. The first challenge came within minutes of the lesson beginning, when Brandon raised his hand and asked, with exaggerated politeness, whether Grandma Patterson thought her old-school approach to creative writing was still relevant in the age of digital storytelling and multimedia communication. The question was delivered with perfect deniability while actually questioning Maggie's understanding of contemporary literary forms and modern educational approaches. Jessica immediately supported Brandon's challenge with her own seemingly innocent comment about hoping they could modernize the assignment to make it more relevant to today's creative landscape. Her suggestion was wrapped in educational terminology that gave it academic legitimacy, while actually undermining Maggie's lesson planning and pedagogical expertise. The coordination between Brandon and Jessica was seamless and sophisticated, demonstrating the kind of tactical planning that had made their campaign so effective throughout the day. They had refined their psychological pressure techniques based on morning feedback, and their afternoon approach was more direct and aggressive than their initial probing operations. Maggie responded to their challenges with professional calm, acknowledging their interest in contemporary forms, while defending the educational value of traditional creative writing skills. Digital storytelling builds on fundamental narrative techniques, she explained. Understanding character development and dialogue will enhance your ability to work in any medium. Her response was educationally sound and professionally delivered. But Maggie could see that Brandon and Jessica interpreted her defensive explanation as evidence that their psychological pressure was having the desired effect. Their subtle smiles and meaningful glances suggested they believed their strategy was succeeding in making her appear uncertain and outdated. The escalation continued throughout the period, with Brandon and Jessica taking turns to question various aspects of Maggie's teaching approach while maintaining the appearance of engaged students seeking clarification. They challenged her understanding of modern creative processes, suggested that her examples were too old-fashioned for contemporary students, and repeatedly used the grandma nickname while pretending it was a term of endearment. Other students in the class began to pick up on the pattern, with several adding their own comments about hoping for more current approaches to creative writing instruction. The social pressure was building as Brandon and Jessica successfully influenced their classmates to participate in undermining Maggie's authority. The culminating moment came 20 minutes before the end of class, when Jessica stood up and announced that she was concerned about the quality of instruction and wanted to speak with the administration about ensuring that substitute teachers were properly qualified to handle advanced creative writing classes. Jessica's dramatic performance was perfectly timed and expertly delivered, creating a public confrontation that would either force Maggie to appear weak by allowing the challenge to go unanswered or provide social media content by responding with visible frustration. The strategy represented the culmination of their day-long campaign, designed to create a viral moment that would cement their narrative about the ineffective substitute teacher. Maggie stood quietly for a moment, looking around the classroom at the faces of students who were waiting to see how she would respond to this direct challenge to her professional competence. She could see the phones recording her reaction, the anticipatory energy of teenagers who expected to witness an adult losing control, and the satisfied expressions of Brandon and Jessica, who believed their psychological operation had achieved decisive success. The silence stretched for several seconds as Maggie considered her options. She could report the disrespectful behavior to the administration, attempt to continue teaching despite the disruption, or demonstrate capabilities that her students had not anticipated and could not understand, without additional context about her background and experience. When Maggie finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality than it had throughout the day. Not the careful professionalism of someone trying to avoid confrontation, but the calm authority of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than teenage psychological warfare. "Jessica," Maggie said quietly, her tone remaining respectful but carrying an undertone that made several students look up from their phones with sudden attention. "I appreciate your concern about educational quality. However, I think you might be surprised by what you could learn if you focused on the assignment rather than testing my patience." The response was delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested Maggie possessed resources and capabilities that her students had not yet discovered. Something in her tone and body language made Brandon's smirk fade slightly, while Jessica's theatrical confidence flickered with uncertainty. As the final bell rang, ending 7th period, students gathered their materials with the buzzing energy of teenagers who sensed that their social experiment had taken an unexpected turn. Brandon and Jessica exchanged glances that mixed satisfaction with growing curiosity about the substitute teacher who had remained calm despite their most aggressive psychological pressure tactics. The school day was ending, but Maggie Patterson understood that her real challenges were just beginning. The grandma narrative had spread throughout Riverside Valley's social networks, creating expectations for continued entertainment and escalation that would inevitably spill beyond classroom boundaries. As students streamed toward the exit, Maggie remained in her classroom, organizing materials and considering her options for the battles that lay ahead. The boxing gloves in her apartment closet seemed less like relics from a distant past and more like tools that might soon prove relevant to her current situation. The faculty parking lot at Riverside Valley High School was nearly empty by 4:30 p.m., with most teachers having departed for their evening routines shortly after the final bell. Maggie Patterson sat in her modest Honda Civic, reviewing the day's events and considering her limited options for dealing with the escalating situation that threatened to undermine not only her effectiveness as a substitute teacher, but potentially her entire second career in education. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the district's substitute coordinator, asking for her assessment of the day and whether she would be available for additional assignments at Riverside Valley. The timing of the inquiry suggested that reports of classroom disruptions had already reached administrative attention. Though whether through official channels or social media remained unclear, Maggie typed a brief response indicating that she had completed her assignment successfully and would be available for future bookings, though she omitted the details about the coordinated harassment campaign that had dominated her afternoon classes. Her military experience had taught her that some battles were better fought through direct action rather than appealing to authority figures who might not understand the full scope of the problem. As she prepared to leave the parking lot, Maggie noticed Brandon Mitchell's expensive pickup truck still parked near the athletic building, suggesting that football practice was keeping him occupied for at least another hour. Jessica Ward's luxury SUV was positioned in the student lot with a small crowd of admirers gathered around it, their animated conversation and frequent laughter indicating that the day's entertainment was still being discussed and analyzed. The drive home provided Maggie with solitude to process the sophisticated nature of the psychological campaign that had been directed against her. These weren't random acts of teenage rebellion or simple disrespect for substitute teachers, but carefully coordinated operations designed to create viral social media content while systematically undermining her authority and credibility. Her apartment complex appeared peaceful when she arrived, with no signs of the digital warfare that was undoubtedly continuing through Riverside Valley's social networks. Maggie parked in her designated space and climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit, carrying her briefcase and the weight of decisions that would determine how she responded to challenges that extended far beyond normal educational boundaries. Apartment reflected Maggie's practical approach to retirement living, furnished with comfortable pieces that prioritized function over decoration. The walls displayed no personal photographs or memorabilia that might reveal details about her previous career, though careful observers might have noticed the unusual precision with which everything was organized and the strategic positioning of furniture that provided clear sight lines to all entrances. Maggie set her briefcase on the kitchen table and moved through her daily security routine, checking the small indicators she used to monitor whether anyone had attempted entry during her absence. The habits formed during decades of professional caution remained as automatic as breathing, though she had hoped that civilian life would eventually allow her to relax the vigilance that had been essential for survival in more dangerous environments. Her landline phone rang as she was preparing dinner, the caller ID showing a number she recognized as belonging to Principal Dr. Sarah Chun at Riverside Valley High School. Maggie answered with professional courtesy, though her tactical instincts immediately focused on the potential implications of after-hours administrative contact. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Chun began, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested she was navigating sensitive territory. "I wanted to follow up on your first day at Riverside Valley and see how things went from your perspective." The question was phrased as routine administrative interest, but Maggie's experience had taught her to recognize when authority figures were seeking information about situations that had attracted their attention through unofficial channels. Dr. Chun's timing and tone suggested that reports of classroom disruptions had reached her through student complaints, parent communications, or social media monitoring. "The day went well, Dr. Chen," Maggie replied, choosing her words carefully to provide accurate information without revealing the full scope of the psychological warfare that had been directed against her. The students were energetic and engaged, though some seemed more interested in testing boundaries than focusing on academic content. Dr. Chun's response indicated that Maggie's assessment aligned with information she had received from other sources. "I appreciate your diplomatic phrasing, Mrs. Patterson. I've received some reports about student behavior that concerns me, and I wanted to make sure you felt supported in maintaining classroom management and educational standards." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Dr. Chun asking detailed questions about specific incidents and student interactions. Maggie provided professional responses that acknowledged challenges without appearing to complain or request special intervention. Understanding that substitute teachers who reported too many problems were often viewed as ineffective rather than victimized. "I'm particularly concerned about reports of age-related comments and disrespectful nicknames," Dr. Chun said, her tone becoming more serious as the conversation progressed. "That kind of behavior violates our anti-bullying policies and creates hostile educational environments that we cannot tolerate." Maggie recognized the administrative liability concerns that were driving Dr. Chun's interest in the situation. Age discrimination claims and hostile workplace allegations could create significant legal and public relations problems for the school district, making administrative intervention a necessity rather than a courtesy. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Chun," Maggie said, maintaining her professional tone while considering how much detail to provide about the sophisticated nature of the campaign against her. "Some students did seem to focus more on my age than my qualifications, but I handled the situations appropriately and maintained classroom instruction throughout the day." Dr. Chun's relief was audible as she processed Maggie's response. "I'm glad to hear that you handled things professionally. However, I want you to know that we take these issues seriously, and I'll be monitoring the situation closely to ensure that all students understand our expectations for respectful behavior toward faculty and substitute teachers." The call ended with Dr. Chun promising to address the behavioral issues directly with the students involved, though Maggie understood that administrative intervention would likely escalate rather than resolve the conflict. Teenagers who were publicly disciplined for psychological warfare often responded with more sophisticated and covert tactics that were harder to detect and prove. After dinner, Maggie settled into her reading chair with a cup of tea and began researching the students who had been most actively involved in the day's harassment campaign. Her laptop provided access to public social media profiles, local newspaper archives, and school district websites that contained information about academic achievements, athletic accomplishments, and family backgrounds. Brandon Mitchell's digital footprint revealed the kind of privileged lifestyle that Maggie had suspected based on his classroom behavior and material possessions. His family's auto dealership business appeared frequently in local business news, and his father's involvement in community organizations suggested the kind of political connections that could complicate administrative discipline efforts. Brandon's social media accounts showcased expensive vacations, designer clothing, and luxury vehicles that emphasized his family's wealth and social status. More importantly for Maggie's tactical analysis, his posts demonstrated sophisticated understanding of image management and audience engagement that explained his effectiveness in coordinating psychological pressure campaigns. Jessica Ward's online presence was even more revealing, showcasing not only her family's professional success, but her own strategic approach to social influence and reputation management. Her father's position as head of surgery at the regional medical center provided social credibility that translated into leadership opportunities and reduced accountability for aggressive behavior. Jessica's Instagram and TikTok accounts demonstrated advanced skills in content creation, audience manipulation, and viral marketing that made her dangerous opponents in any battle conducted through social media channels. Her follower counts and engagement rates indicated real influence within the local teenage community, making her capable of mobilizing significant social pressure against targets. Marcus Thompson's digital profile revealed technical capabilities that extended far beyond typical teenage social media usage. His equipment reviews, programming tutorials, and cybersecurity discussions indicated genuine expertise in areas that could be weaponized for surveillance, information gathering, and digital harassment campaigns. More concerning for Maggie's operational security was Marcus's apparent interest in military technology and defense contracting, topics that suggested curiosity about backgrounds like hers that extended beyond casual social media stalking. His mother's position in the school district's administrative offices provided access to personnel records and policy information that could be exploited for intelligence gathering. As Maggie continued her research, she discovered that the three students had collaborated on previous campaigns against other targets, including a substitute teacher who had resigned after 2 days of harassment and a new student whose family had ultimately transferred to a different school district. Their tactics were refined through experience and enhanced by technical capabilities that made them formidable opponents in psychological warfare. The most disturbing discovery came when Maggie found archived social media posts documenting their previous campaigns, complete with videos of adult authority figures losing composure under pressure and detailed analysis of the most effective techniques for creating viral content from educational disruptions. These students weren't engaged in random bullying, but conducting systematic operations designed to destroy their target's credibility and effectiveness. Her investigation was interrupted by a knock at her apartment door, an unexpected visitor. At 8:30 p.m., that immediately activated the security protocols that had become automatic during her previous career. Maggie approached the door with caution, checking the peephole and noting the sight lines and escape routes that would be available if the situation required tactical response. The visitor was a teenage girl who appeared to be approximately 16 years old, with dark hair and nervous energy that suggested she was struggling with whatever had brought her to Maggie's apartment. The girl's body language indicated fear rather than aggression, though Maggie's experience had taught her that apparent vulnerability could be tactical deception designed to lower defenses. "Mrs. Patterson?" the girl said when Maggie opened the door with the security chain still engaged. "My name is Maria Santos, and I'm a sophomore at Riverside Valley. I heard about what happened today, and I thought you should know some things about Brandon and his friends that might help you understand what you're dealing with." Maggie's tactical assessment of Maria indicated genuine concern rather than deception, though she remained cautious about accepting information from unknown sources who might be operating on behalf of her opponents. However, Maria's obvious nervousness and the risk she was taking by approaching Maggie's residence suggested that her intelligence might be valuable. "How did you get my address, Maria?" Maggie asked, maintaining the security chain while processing the implications of her residential location being known to students. Maria's explanation revealed another concerning aspect of the campaign against Maggie. Marcus Thompson posted it on a private group chat earlier tonight. He said people should know where the crazy substitute lives in case anyone wants to help her understand how things work at Riverside Valley. The revelation that her personal address had been discovered and distributed represented a significant escalation that moved the conflict beyond school boundaries and into territory that could legally be considered stalking or harassment. Maggie's operational security had been more thoroughly compromised than she had realized after verifying Maria's identity and motivation through careful questioning. Maggie allowed her into the apartment while maintaining awareness of potential surveillance or deception. Maria's information proved to be valuable intelligence about the scope and sophistication of the campaign. being conducted against substitute teachers and other targets. Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus have been doing this for almost 2 years. Maria explained, her voice quiet but determined as she provided details that wouldn't be available through public sources. They target substitute teachers, new students, and anyone else they think won't be able to fight back effectively. They've gotten really good at making it look like harmless pranks, while actually destroying people's reputations and mental health. Maria's account included specific details about previous campaigns, techniques that had proven most effective for creating viral content, and coordination methods that involved dozens of other students who participated in harassment activities while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. The grandma thing is just the beginning, Maria continued, her expression becoming more serious as she described escalation patterns that Maggie needed to understand. They'll start showing up in places where you go outside of school, making fake complaints to the administration, and trying to get other students to record you having breakdowns or losing control. The intelligence that Maria provided confirmed Maggie's assessment that she was facing opponents who had refined their psychological warfare techniques through extensive practice and possessed resources that extended far beyond typical teenage capabilities. Their campaign wasn't random harassment, but systematic destruction conducted by individuals who understood how to exploit institutional weaknesses and social media dynamics. "Why are you telling me this, Maria?" Maggie asked, recognizing the personal risk that the teenager was accepting by providing intelligence about popular students who had demonstrated willingness to retaliate against anyone who interfered with their operations. Maria's response revealed the broader impact of Brandon's group that extended far beyond their primary targets. "Because they made my freshman year hell when I wouldn't participate in one of their campaigns against a student teacher. I know what they're capable of, and I know that most adults don't understand how sophisticated their tactics are until it's too late to fight back effectively." The conversation continued for another hour, with Maria providing detailed intelligence about coordination methods, escalation patterns, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited if Maggie chose to respond with her own strategic campaign. The information was valuable tactical intelligence, though it also confirmed that peaceful resolution was unlikely given the systematic nature of their operations. After Maria left, Maggie spent several hours analyzing the intelligence she had received and considering her options for responding to opponents who possessed capabilities and resources that exceeded those of typical teenage bullies. Her research and Maria's information had revealed that she was facing a coordinated group with experience in psychological warfare, technical skills for surveillance and harassment, and family connections that provided protection from normal administrative consequences. The conflict had escalated beyond simple classroom management into territory that required strategic thinking and tactical planning that drew on capabilities from her previous career. Maggie understood that her opponents expected her to respond like a typical substitute teacher, appealing to authority, avoiding confrontation, and ultimately retreating from challenges that exceeded her comfort zone. However, Margaret Patterson possessed resources and experience that Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus could not anticipate and would not understand until it was too late for them to adjust their tactics accordingly. The boxing gloves in her closet represented more than exercise equipment or nostalgic memorabilia. They were tools from a career that had taught her how to respond when psychological warfare escalated to levels that required direct action. As Maggie prepared for bed, she realized that her peaceful retirement and second career in education might require drawing on skills and experience that she had hoped to leave undisturbed. The teenagers who thought they were terrorizing a helpless substitute teacher were about to discover that some opponents possessed capabilities that could not be neutralized through social media campaigns and psychological pressure. The battle lines had been drawn, intelligence had been gathered, and escalation seemed inevitable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Margaret Patterson was beginning to understand that her response would need to be calibrated not for typical educational environments, but for psychological warfare conducted by opponents who had never faced someone with her particular combination of experience, capabilities, and determination to protect the educational mission that had become her calling. The gymnasium at Riverside Valley High School echoed with the sounds of sneakers squeaking against polished hardwood and the rhythmic bouncing of basketballs as the after-school intramural program began its evening session. Maggie Patterson stood in the doorway, observing the activities while mentally cataloging the layout, equipment, and sightlines that characterized the large open space where she had decided to make her stand. 3 days had passed since her initial confrontation with Brandon Mitchell's group, and the harassment campaign had escalated exactly as Maria Santos had predicted. Fake complaints had been filed with the administration claiming that Grandma Patterson was using outdated teaching methods and creating hostile learning environments. Social media posts had appeared documenting her confusion with modern technology and her inability to connect with contemporary students. Most disturbing for Maggie's operational security, students had begun appearing at locations she frequented outside of school: the grocery store, the library, the coffee shop where she graded papers, recording her daily activities and posting content that portrayed her as a confused elderly woman who was failing to adapt to retirement. The surveillance and harassment had moved far beyond school boundaries into territory that legally constituted stalking. Dr. Chun had called that morning to inform Maggie that several parents had requested her removal from the substitute teacher roster, citing concerns about educational quality and age-related competency issues. The principal's tone suggested she was trying to be supportive, while managing political pressure from influential families who possessed the resources to create problems for the school district. "I want to give you an opportunity to address these concerns directly," Dr. Chen had said, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that indicated she was offering a chance for damage control rather than genuine support. "Some of the students involved have agreed to participate in a mediated discussion this afternoon, and I think it might help clear up any misunderstandings." Maggie had accepted the invitation while understanding that the mediated discussion was actually a carefully orchestrated confrontation designed to create additional viral content while providing the appearance of administrative fairness. Brandon's group had successfully manipulated the system to create a public forum where they could document her defeat, while claiming they were seeking resolution through proper channels. The meeting was scheduled for 4 p.m. in the gymnasium, chosen because the open space could accommodate the larger audience that Dr. Chun expected would attend. Word had spread throughout the school's social networks that the grandma substitute would be facing her accusers in a public confrontation that promised to provide the dramatic conclusion to their campaign. As Maggie entered the gymnasium, she immediately identified the tactical situation that had been arranged for her disadvantage. Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus were positioned near the center of the space, with approximately 30 other students arranged in a semicircle around them, all equipped with phones and recording devices to document whatever humiliation they expected to witness. Dr. Chun stood near the bleachers with 2 other administrators, their positioning suggesting they intended to observe rather than actively moderate the discussion. Several parents were present, including Mrs. Wells from the school board and Mr. Mitchell from the auto dealership, their expensive clothing and confident postures indicating they expected to witness the resolution of a problem that had threatened their children's social dominance. The audience filled the gymnasium with anticipatory energy that reminded Maggie of pre-fight crowds she had encountered during her previous career, though the stakes here involved reputation and professional credibility rather than physical survival. Every face was focused on her entrance, waiting to see how the elderly substitute teacher would handle the coordinated psychological assault that had been prepared for her humiliation. Brandon stepped forward as Maggie approached the center of the gymnasium, His movement coordinated with Jessica and Marcus to create a formation that maximized their psychological impact while ensuring optimal camera angles for the documentation that would inevitably appear on social media platforms. Within hours, "Mrs. Patterson," Brandon began, his voice carrying clearly across the gymnasium with the kind of theatrical concern that had characterized his previous performances. "We appreciate you taking the time to address the concerns that students and parents have raised about your teaching methods and your ability to connect with modern educational environments." The opening statement was perfectly crafted to establish Brandon as a reasonable student advocate while framing Maggie as the subject of legitimate concerns about competency and effectiveness. His delivery was smooth and confident, enhanced by weeks of practice in psychological manipulation and audience management. Jessica positioned herself to Brandon's right, her phone recording while she prepared to contribute her own carefully rehearsed comments about educational quality and contemporary learning standards. Marcus flanked the left side of their formation, his technical equipment actively documenting everything while monitoring social media responses to live streams that were already broadcasting the confrontation. "We understand that adapting to new teaching methods can be challenging for people of your generation," Jessica added, her voice carrying false sympathy while actually emphasizing Maggie's age as a liability rather than an asset. "But we're concerned that students are suffering when substitute teachers can't provide the kind of engaging, technology-integrated instruction that we need to succeed in college and careers." The accusation was wrapped in educational terminology that gave it academic legitimacy while actually questioning Maggie's fundamental competence as an educator. Jessica's delivery was polished and convincing, enhanced by her experience in creating content that would resonate with adult audiences who might view the confrontation through traditional media channels. The assembled students murmured approval for Jessica's comments, their responses clearly coordinated through social media, communications that had prepared them to participate in the psychological assault. Phone cameras captured every reaction, ensuring that the audience's support for Brandon's group would be documented and distributed as evidence of community consensus about Maggie's inadequacy. Dr. Chun stepped forward from her observer position, apparently recognizing that the mediated discussion was rapidly becoming a public trial that could create liability issues for the school district. "Let's make sure everyone has an opportunity to express their perspectives respectfully," she said, though her tone suggested she was hoping to conclude the meeting quickly rather than genuinely facilitate productive dialogue. Maggie looked around the gymnasium at the faces watching her with mixtures of anticipation, amusement, and predatory satisfaction. She could see the careful positioning of recording devices, the coordinated body language of students who had been prepared to respond to whatever she said, and the confident expressions of teenagers who believed they had successfully orchestrated her public defeat. For 62 years, Margaret Patterson had faced challenges that ranged from personal disappointment to life-threatening danger, but she had never encountered opponents who possessed the sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities that these teenagers had developed through years of practice and technological enhancement. Their campaign had been expertly executed, systematically destroying her credibility while maintaining plausible deniability about their malicious intent. However, the gymnasium setting had reminded Maggie of environments where she had achieved some of her greatest professional successes, and the confrontational atmosphere had triggered memories of capabilities that retirement hadn't erased. The teenagers who thought they were witnessing the final humiliation of a helpless substitute teacher were about to discover that some opponents possessed resources that couldn't be neutralized through social media campaigns. "Brandon, Jessica, Marcus," Maggie said quietly, her voice carrying across the gymnasium with a different quality than it had possessed during their previous interactions. Something in her tone made several students look up from their phones with sudden attention, while the confident smirks on her primary opponents' faces flickered with uncertainty. I appreciate your concern about educational quality, Maggie continued, walking slowly toward the center of the gymnasium while maintaining eye contact with each of her accusers. But before we discuss my teaching methods, I think you should understand something about my background that might change your perspective on what I'm capable of providing your education. Dr. Chun's expression shifted from administrative neutrality to growing concern, as she recognized that Maggie's demeanor had changed in ways that suggested the discussion was about to take an unexpected direction. The assembled parents exchanged glances that mixed confusion with anticipation, unsure what revelation might emerge from the substitute teacher they had expected to see defeated. Maggie reached into her bag and withdrew a pair of worn leather boxing gloves, the kind of equipment that had been shaped by years of intensive use in professional training environments. The gloves were scarred and discolored by countless training sessions, bearing the unmistakable signs of authentic combat experience rather than recreational fitness activities. The reaction in the gymnasium was immediate and dramatic. Students, who had been recording with casual confidence, suddenly focused their attention entirely on Maggie, while the coordinated murmur of prepared responses gave way to genuine surprise and uncertainty. Brandon's theatrical posture stiffened as he processed implications that his research hadn't anticipated, while Jessica's practiced smile faltered as she realized their narrative was about to be challenged by information they hadn't prepared to address. "These gloves," Maggie said, holding them up so that everyone in the gymnasium could see the authentic wear patterns and professional quality construction, represent 35 years of professional boxing training and competition. I retired from the amateur circuit with a record of 47 wins and 3 losses, including 2 regional championships and qualification for Olympic trials that I couldn't attend due to family circumstances. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled audience as students struggled to reconcile the image of the elderly substitute teacher with the reality of someone who had achieved elite-level success in one of the most demanding combat sports. Phone cameras that had been recording her expected humiliation were now documenting a revelation that would completely transform the viral content they had planned to create. Marcus's technical equipment captured every detail as Maggie continued, her explanation with the kind of calm authority that had once commanded respect from world-class athletes and international competition officials. After retiring from competition, I spent 20 years training fighters in some of Chicago's most challenging gyms, working with teenagers who reminded me a lot of some of you, young people who thought they could intimidate anyone who seemed vulnerable or different. Brandon attempted to recover his composure by challenging the relevance of Maggie's boxing background to educational competency, but his voice carried less confidence than it had possessed at the beginning of the confrontation. "That's very interesting, Mrs. Patterson, but we're here to discuss your teaching abilities, not your hobbies from decades ago." Maggie's response was delivered with a slight smile that suggested Brandon had misunderstood the significance of her revelation. "Boxing isn't just about physical combat, Brandon. It's about strategy, timing, reading your opponents, and understanding when psychological pressure requires a direct response. Skills that translate remarkably well to educational environments where some students think they can use coordinated harassment to drive away teachers they don't respect." The shift in power dynamics was visible throughout the gymnasium as students began to understand that their psychological warfare campaign had been directed against someone who possessed capabilities they hadn't anticipated. The confident predators, who had spent weeks documenting her supposed weakness, were discovering that their elderly target had been analyzing their tactics with the same strategic thinking that had made her successful in professional combat. Jessica attempted to regain control of the narrative by questioning why Maggie hadn't mentioned her boxing background during her previous teaching assignments, but her question was delivered with noticeably less authority than her earlier accusations. "If you have all this experience, why didn't you use it to handle classroom management more effectively?" Maggie's answer revealed the strategic thinking that had guided her response to their harassment campaign from the beginning. Because effective teachers don't use intimidation to manage student behavior, Jessica. I hoped that professional competence and respect for educational goals would be sufficient to maintain productive learning environments. However, when students escalate to psychological warfare and systematic harassment, sometimes more direct approaches become necessary. Dr. Chun stepped forward again, clearly recognizing that the meeting had moved far beyond administrative mediation into territory that could create additional complications for the school district. Mrs. Patterson, while your athletic background is impressive, I'm not sure how it addresses the specific concerns that have been raised about teaching methods and student engagement. Maggie's response demonstrated her understanding of the political dynamics that had created the confrontation, while establishing her willingness to address the real issues rather than the manufactured complaints. Dr. Chun, the concerns that brought us here today aren't actually about teaching methods or educational quality. They're about 3 students who have developed sophisticated techniques for destroying the credibility of substitute teachers and other targets through coordinated harassment campaigns. The accusation was delivered with the kind of calm precision that made it impossible to dismiss as a defensive reaction or paranoid speculation. Maggie's tone carried the authority of someone who had analyzed the situation thoroughly and possessed evidence to support her conclusions. Brendan, Jessica, and Marcus have spent weeks documenting my supposed incompetence while actually conducting a systematic campaign designed to create viral social media content at my expense, Maggie continued, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent gymnasium. Their techniques include age-based harassment, coordinated classroom disruption, surveillance of my personal activities, and manipulation of administrative procedures to create this public confrontation. The detailed analysis of their tactics sent visible shockwaves through the assembled audience as parents and administrators began to understand the sophisticated nature of the campaign that had been conducted under the guise of legitimate educational concerns. Phone recordings that had been intended to document Maggie's defeat were now capturing her systematic exposure of psychological warfare techniques that most adults didn't understand well enough to identify or counter. Marcus attempted to defend their actions by claiming they were simply trying to ensure educational quality for all students. But his protest lacked conviction, as Maggie's analysis had accurately described methods that required significant coordination and technical capability to execute effectively. Marcus, Maggie said, looking directly at him with the kind of steady gaze that had once intimidated opponents in professional competition, your social media forensics and coordination abilities are impressive for someone your age. But you made a tactical error when you distributed my personal address and encouraged harassment at my residence. That escalation moved your campaign beyond school boundaries into territory that law enforcement takes seriously regardless of your age or family connections. The revelation that their activities had crossed legal boundaries created immediate concern among the parents and administrators who had expected to witness a routine discussion of educational concerns. Mrs. Wells and Mr. Mitchell exchanged worried glances as they began to understand that their children's sophisticated harassment campaign could have consequences that extended far beyond school disciplinary measures. Dr. Chun's expression shifted to administrative alarm as she processed the implications of systematic harassment, stalking, and potentially criminal behavior that had been conducted by students under her supervision. The liability issues alone could create serious problems for the school district, while the revelation of coordinated psychological warfare would require investigation and intervention that she wasn't prepared to handle. However, Maggie continued, her tone becoming slightly less confrontational as she offered an opportunity for resolution that would benefit everyone involved. I'm willing to treat this situation as a learning opportunity rather than a law enforcement matter, provided that Certain conditions are met immediately and permanently. The offer of negotiated settlement, rather than criminal prosecution, created visible relief among the parents and administrators, though Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus appeared uncertain about what conditions might be required for avoiding more serious consequences. Maggie's terms were delivered with the kind of clear authority that made them sound like non-negotiable requirements rather than suggestions for consideration. First, all harassment activities stop immediately and permanently. No more social media posts, no more surveillance, no more coordination with other students to disrupt my classes or personal activities. The first condition was reasonable and necessary, though the teenagers' expression suggested they were struggling to accept the end of a campaign that had provided entertainment and social media content for weeks. Second, Maggie continued, you will use your social media influence to correct the false narrative you've created about my competence and teaching abilities. Public acknowledgement that your complaints were motivated by personal conflict rather than legitimate educational concerns. The requirement for public retraction would be humiliating for students who had built their reputations on successful psychological warfare campaigns, but it was essential for protecting Maggie's credibility and future effectiveness as an educator. Third, you will participate in a genuine educational project that demonstrates the research and analytical skills you've been using for harassment can be redirected toward productive academic achievement. I want a comprehensive report on anti-bullying strategies that could be implemented at Riverside Valley to protect other students from the techniques you've been using. The final condition was designed to transform their capabilities from destructive to constructive while ensuring they understood the broader impact of their actions on other potential victims. The gymnasium remained silent as Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus processed the terms that would allow them to avoid criminal prosecution while requiring them to acknowledge the systematic nature of their harassment campaign. Their parents' expressions made it clear that cooperation with Maggie's requirements was strongly preferred to law enforcement investigation of their children's activities. Dr. Chun broke the silence by expressing her commitment to ensuring that the agreement was implemented fully and that similar harassment campaigns would be prevented through policy changes and increased administrative awareness of sophisticated psychological warfare techniques. Brandon was the first to speak, his earlier confidence completely replaced by the kind of respectful tone that suggested he finally understood the seriousness of the situation they had created. Mrs. Patterson, we accept your conditions. We didn't realize that our actions had crossed legal boundaries or that they were causing the kind of harm that you're describing. Jessica and Marcus quickly added their own acknowledgments, though their expressions suggested they were still processing the complete reversal of power dynamics that had transformed them from confident predators to contrite teenagers seeking forgiveness from their intended victim. The resolution that followed proceeded with surprising efficiency as parents, administrators, and students worked together to address the immediate concerns while establishing systems to prevent similar harassment campaigns in the future. Social media posts were deleted or corrected, public apologies were issued, and genuine educational projects began to replace the destructive activities that had consumed weeks of sophisticated planning and coordination. Over the following months, Maggie Patterson's reputation at Riverside Valley High School evolved from that of a vulnerable substitute teacher to a respected educator, whose background commanded genuine admiration from students and colleagues alike. Her boxing experience became a source of inspiration rather than intimidation, encouraging other students to pursue their own athletic and academic goals with the dedication and strategic thinking that had made her successful in both competition and education. Brandon, Jessica, and Marcus discovered that their capabilities for research, coordination, and social influence could be directed toward positive goals that earned genuine respect rather than fear-based compliance. Their anti-bullying report became a model for other schools in the district, and their transformation from systematic harassers to student advocates demonstrated the potential for redemption when consequences were coupled with opportunities for constructive engagement. The boxing gloves returned to Maggie's closet, but their brief appearance in the gymnasium had achieved something that decades of administrative policies and disciplinary procedures had failed to accomplish: the complete elimination of systematic harassment campaigns at Riverside Valley High School and the establishment of a learning environment where respect was based on genuine appreciation for competence and character rather than fear of social retaliation. Margaret Patterson had proven that sometimes the most effective response to psychological warfare was demonstrating capabilities that opponents couldn't anticipate, neutralize, or understand until they were faced with consequences that made cooperation more attractive than continued conflict. The elderly substitute teacher had taught her most important lesson not through curriculum or classroom management, but by showing that some secrets were worth keeping until the moment when revealing them could transform weakness into strength and turn bullies into allies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.